you're essentially walking through my rose garden. So that's what you see. I took this picture from the sidewalk. Okay, I've painted my house since. So we're going to talk about why roses. Why are roses so important to people? And why do we have a group this size to talk about roses? We'll talk about rose classifications. If you're shopping for roses, then there are all kinds of ways that we organize roses. And, you know, people who like roses kind of figure it out, but a lot of people don't really understand what is the difference between all these kinds of roses. And we organize roses in all kinds of ways. We'll get into that. And then we'll talk about rose care, because you're here, hopefully, to learn how to maximize what will be the first major bloom cycle that we have, which will come up in May, June. And then just sort of maximize your experience with roses for this season, and, you know, for seasons to come. So, number one, when I suggest roses, and if you're talking to me about plants, if I'm walking you through the yard, and people say, you know, I need something that looks good, and I want it to bloom all the time, and whatever else, I say, well, have you thought about a rose? And easily half people say, oh God, no, I don't want roses. And I kind of wonder why, right? And one thing is, of course, they've got thorns, and people don't like thorns. And unfortunately, by and large, roses have thorns. So if thorns are the deal breaker, then you can just get up and leave. However, if you kind of deal with that fact, you will find that roses are incredibly unique compared to a lot of other landscape plants. Roses do require some pruning. And people also don't like to hear that because they don't want to work that hard. There are some roses that are easier to prune, but also as long as you don't build up a collection of 100 of them, then rose pruning is something that might not be as scary as you might think first. Roses can get some pests, it's true. But not as many pests as you might think. Especially if you do research online, they'll talk about all kinds of pests that other parts of the world have. Utah is unique in that we have less than a lot of other places. Those thorns still keep coming up. What about the thorns, they say? You do have to feed your roses, because roses work incredibly hard, because the reason why you're planting a rose is to get flowers. And those flowers take work. And so they take spare parts, and that's where feeding comes in to make sure that your roses have what they need to give you what you want from them. You do have to do some care in overwintering them, which we kind of do with a lot of your landscape, but roses are no exception. And then, of course, they still have thorns. They mentioned thorns. Roses have thorns. Okay. So why not roses? Well, how about now let's talk about how come we do have roses. And for one thing, it is the world's most popular flower. If you want to fit in like that, that's it. It is America's national flower. In the 1980s, it was determined that America needed to have a national flower, and the rose is it. There is a millennia, and we'll talk about the history just briefly, of symbolism with roses. The bloom, the thorn, joy, sorrow, love, you know, that kind of stuff. So that symbolism that a rose tends to embody is something that has been going on for a long time. When people turned to roses before just planting them for flowers, they did it because, where do I push the button here? Here we go. Do I have that? Yes. So originally, roses were planted for fragrance. And that fragrance was also a way that you could get rose oils and perfumes. Rose water was used a lot for medicine and cooking. In fact, we take vanilla for granted. And vanilla is actually a relatively new item in cooking. Only in the late 19th century, early 20th century was vanilla becoming more and more available. Prior to that, what was used? Rose water, exactly, right? And then they've always been a symbol of love and celebration, right? So let's get into this. More reasons why roses. Roses are ever blooming, but I put that in quotes because they don't necessarily bloom all the time. But pound for pound, they're giving you more flowers than any other bush you're going to plant in your garden, even perennials, right? There's no shrub that gives you more color variety and more flower shape variety than roses do, okay? They have fragrance, but be prepared. I'm going to break your heart about that in a second, right? If you're into this, from a biofeedback standpoint, roses hum at a frequency of 320 megahertz, which means they actually make you feel good. It stimulates the love response.
You want to feel really good.
I feel great out there, exactly. So that's important. I mean, roses, the bushes are alive, and what they are doing is an energy source. And you will feel it when you're going out there to see the roses. So you're lucky you live in Utah, because Utah is probably the best place in the country to grow roses. At least it's one of the best. You go to Portland and they brag about being Rose City, USA. They got all kinds of problems with roses that we don't have. It's because we have low humidity, we have tons of sunshine, and in fact we almost have too much sunshine, frankly. We have a relative lack of problems when it comes to roses. And then we have, as we can find this year, very almost too mild of a winter. We'll call it mild-ish winters. They're not too tough, right? And so that all combines to do a lot of good things for roses. That's my fragrant cloud. Okay. So the brief history of roses. Roses, if you think about roses, they come in three major time eras. Roses have been blooming and growing on Earth for 30 million years. There's fossil evidence of it. And then about 4,000 years ago, we began to cultivate roses for the reasons of fragrance and perfume and oils and things like that. That era goes all the way from roughly 2000 BC to the middle of the 1800s. And then after the middle of the 1800s, something magical happened to the rose world. And that ushered in what is now, we're still in, the modern era of roses, okay? So, what do I got here? Can I get rid of this? Why do I have full security?
I don't know why that popped up.
All right.
You can use the mouse to click on the actual mouse.
Oh, the mouse. Good.
Yeah.
Good. Okay,
The computer mouse, not a real mouse.
No.
We are in a garden center, so. There you go.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't know why that popped up.
Here we go. So, there is evidence that the ancient Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, were actively cultivating roses 2000 BC. That tradition of cultivating roses spread to the Egyptians, and then to the Greeks, and then to the Romans, where they really took it over. And the Roman Empire then spreads, that moves into Europe. Then the Roman Empire falls apart, and roses actually fall out of favor. Then the Crusades happen, and roses are rediscovered by the Europeans. And by 1200, roses were the big thing again. Now, if roses are a big thing in Europe, then roses are a big thing in their colonies, including the United States. So that's the New World. The cool part about it is that this was all happening on that side, kind of our side of the planet. Meanwhile, the same thing was happening in China. And no one knew about it because there were no trade routes. In the late 1700s, there were trade routes that were opening up between Europe and China. And suddenly you find a whole new bunch of roses and a whole new bunch of genes to find new roses. The original roses were called the four-stud Chinas. And these were roses that were introduced that revolutionized what we had been doing on this side of the planet with roses for upwards of 4,000 years. So, we're now in the modern era of roses. That means that for the first time, you get repeat blooming roses. We all take for granted that roses are ever blooming. That wasn't always the case. For a long history of roses, you get new flower shapes and colors. You get more compact forms of roses. Otherwise, roses in the past were very big and leggy and weird. We get healthier foliage. We get better disease resistance. But here's where your heart begins to break. Because fragrance begins to wane. Because fragrance is a recessive gene. And as you combine and recombine all of these roses during hybridization, recessive genes fall out. And people have been complaining that roses are not fragrant enough since the middle of the 1800s. So it's not a new concern that how come roses aren't as fragrant, right? But I got lots of people coming in here looking for roses, and everybody assumes that I find the one that I want, and it better be fragrant. That is not the case sometimes. So, the 1950s, roses used to be the purview of nobility. You'd find them in monasteries and things like this. It really wasn't until after World War II that roses became everybody's flower, right? In fact, in 1954, the first nationwide color TV broadcast was of the Rose Parade. These are examples of all the different catalogs in the Sunset Western Garden I would talk about in terms of roses. Here's an old ad from Glover Nursery. We were selling roses for $3 for $1. And then, if anybody knows, that's Rose Park. Everybody see the rose? They built a rose into the roadways of Rose Park, and it looks like that. And the idea was, and it was true, all the houses within the rose section all had red roofs. All the houses that were in the stem and leaf section, I mean, there are cul-de-sacs here. Why? Because they're leaves. All of those houses had green roofs. I moved to Fair Park, where I live, which is near Rose Park, and you could still find old houses that needed some roof work, but still had green roofs. This was supposed to be able to be seen from the airport, from the sky. But as planes got bigger, this is too close to the mountains, and so planes don't fly over top. But that is still there today, right? And then also, if you look more carefully at the street names in Rose Park, they're all old style rose names, right? So kind of fun. So now we're going to talk. So we talked about why roses are important. We have been playing with roses for 40 centuries. And so that's why we have kind of, as humans, co-evolved with roses. They've become a very important part of what we think about when we want to plant beautiful things around us. Now we'll talk about how are roses organized, because that will hopefully guide you in finding the rose that you want, right? So we'll talk about how they're classified. There are actual rose classes. So there are big major food groups of roses. And I think you kind of know what those are. Hybrid tea, grandiflora, things like that. We'll talk about bloom shapes, because people are also not only looking for certain kinds of roses, but certain shaped flowers. And there are a lot of different shapes of roses. There's petal count. These guys. David Austin made that a big deal, right? There's fragrance types. So there are different kinds of fragrance. Fragrance is kind of a tough thing to talk about because you need to smell it. But there are different kinds of fragrance types. And then there's obviously colors. And there's all different kinds of colors. So first, let's talk about rose classes. That's my pumpkin patch. So that's also in my park strip. So number one, well, here are all the rose classes. There are hybrid teas. There are floribundas. There are grandifloras. There are climbing roses. They're also called ramblers as well sometimes. If you don't stake them up, they'll just crawl around. There are landscape and ground cover roses. There are now a new class of rose, an English rose, right? There are miniature roses that are being rebranded as patio roses because they're easily put into containers, right? And then you can still find kind of wild-ish roses, species roses, and there's a lot more demand for that as people are getting into more native planting, right? So, number one, let's talk about hybrid tea. And hybrid tea is the most popular class of modern rose, right? It was first introduced in 1867. That is the first hybrid tea rose. That's La France. You can still find La France up in Canada and out in France, in Paris. So there's still those bushes around. It has a wide array of colors and color combinations. You most often associate hybrid tea roses with cut flowers. You go to the florist shop, you're always getting a hybrid tea because of that single bloom per stem that they tend to do. That, of course, is changing. They've got that distinctive shape. At least, people, older generations, when you think of a rose, there's a certain shape you're thinking of. I think younger people are, when they think of a rose, they're thinking of a different kind of rose now. But a lot of people, myself included, when I think of a rose, it's that high-centered shape that you think about, right? It's got the bud that opens, and that bud is still kind of in there, and it starts to peel apart. That is the hybrid T shape of rose. The flowers are huge sometimes. You can get at least 40 or more petals, and at least during that first bloom season when it's cool, you can get flowers of the size of softballs. Okay. They often only form that single bloom per stem, but that's not as reliable as it used to be, at least in my experience, right? The bushes themselves are large. They're vase-shaped. They can be upwards of 8 feet tall if you let them, and they are thorny. So that is something to think about. Those are hybrid teas. The next one's going to be floribunda roses. And floribunda roses are, number one, the name says it, flora, flower, bunda, abundant, a lot. You get more flowers off of floribunda roses, and that was the idea. They were introduced by 1910, 1911 or 12 with hybridizing roses again. And this is the rose class that has the most varieties. Of the 30,000 roses that are out there, most of them, at least more than 50% of them, are floribunda roses. So that is the rose you more likely see out there for sale. The flowers themselves tend to be smaller because the energy of that flower is now spread over not just one flower, but multiple flowers. And there's the big thing. Floribunda roses bloom in sprays. They sometimes will squeeze out one flower, but they usually give you a cluster of flowers. And that cluster is usually organized like a hens and chicks. You usually have 5 flowers, and there's always one in the middle that opens first. Then, as that flower degrades, the others open up, right? So that's kind of how floribunda roses work. The bushes themselves do tend to be a little bit smaller than hybrid tea roses, but I've been very surprised at how large some of my floribundas are. Okay, and sometimes that smaller size tends to lend more massing of color. That's one thing that people do with iceberg roses, right? Icebergs actually can get to be pretty good size, but people do mass those plants so that you get more of a hedge of roses as opposed to what I have, which is obviously a collection of roses. And those roses all stand on their own. Right? Okay, those are floribundas. Grandiflora roses. This is the first grandiflora rose. I don't have one of these, but this is Queen Elizabeth, right? Queen Elizabeth was introduced in, I think, 1967, and it was introduced because what they wanted to do is they crossed hybrid teas and floribundas yet again, and the idea was they wanted to get hybrid tea-like flowers on floribunda-like sprays, okay? And that's what they got for a long time. And they still do to an extent. They were also originally based upon hybrid tea flowers, which means they had that high-centered bloom, right? With the influence of these guys into the marketplace in general, David Alston, a lot of roses now, not all hybrid teas and grandifloras have that high-centered bloom anymore, right? Those are all dressed up. That's a grandiflora, and that does not look like a high-center. Okay? They still have the same similar stocky cane structure of hybrid teas. Sometimes they get bigger. My experience has been, however, that despite being considered a separate rose class, they're kind of indistinguishable. You'll see that in our own collection here. The house that has hybrid teas also has grandifloras in it, and we don't bother making a difference between the two. And if you shop online, there are lots of sources online that will sell you hybrid teas and grandifloras in the same, breath. So gradually what's happening is that you see a lot of your, and this is my experience, a lot of my hybrid tea roses will bloom multiple blooms per stem. They will also send up single flowers. And the same thing will be the case with grandifloras. So not much of a difference anymore. Okay, there's climbing roses. And if you don't let climbing roses lean against something, they're called rambling roses. But what are climbing roses not? They are not vines. They are big, leggy roses that need to lean against something. But they're not vines. People think, well, I want this thing to kind of coil up like a wisteria. It won't, because it's not built to do that, right? what happened was that when you grow a large crop of roses, let's say iceberg, for instance, because you can find iceberg roses that are chlorobundicide, and you can find climbing iceberg. They're the same rose. It just so happens that when you grow 100 of these roses, maybe 2 of them will actually be super vigorous, and so those become the climbers. And they start to then clone those, and now you get a different class of rose, but with the same flower, right? Let's see. That means then that climbing roses will have the same kinds of flowers you find on all the other roses. You can find them that have very hybrid tea-like flowers, that have floribunda-like flowers, that even have miniature-like flowers. Anybody got a climbing rainbow's end? Those are wonderful flowers, and each one of the flowers are minis. Right? They have very stocky canes, and in fact, you need to rely on some of those stocky canes to give your rose the structure that it needs to actually do the climbing thing you want it to do. And that means, however, that you are going to be pruning climbing roses a little different. You're not going to be hacking climbing roses all the way down like you do with other roses, because the idea is to have a larger plant over time. And that's kind of a permanent thing. That's why you plant a climber. Otherwise, don't plant a climber. Right? So, then there's landscape and ground cover roses. Back in the 80s, people got sick of roses, and they wanted something that was going to be easier. And so landscape roses and ground cover roses in the 80s and 90s were introduced. And these are still brands you see today. So there's the flower carpet, there's the drift rose, there's the knockout rose. Easy Elegance is one that's not as common, but we definitely carry it. Oh So Easy, that's a part of the Proven Winners line, which has become a nearly ubiquitous, at least can that you see out there. And the Proven Winners folks grow all kinds of stuff, but they also grow roses too. Again, these were planted because people thought that roses were too labor intensive. So supposedly these roses didn't require any pruning. Really? Really? Yes, they tend to try to push new growth without having to have those hips removed. But it's not as reliable as I think a lot of these roses want you to think. The one thing, though, that these roses do have is they tend to have a lot more busy of an architecture. They don't have the big giant canes, usually, right? That means you can use them a lot more in color blocks, and you can now use them to put a low hedge of roses in as opposed to those individuals. And it looks better. The bush itself is just a neater look, right? Again, they're low growing. Some of the ground cover roses are indeed ground cover roses. They get to be no bigger than 8 to 12 inches tall. And they spread 6 feet. So the idea is now you were spreading things out. This is a median. These are the roses that work hard in these kind of tough to deal with areas otherwise. And then other forms of landscape roses can still get to be at least 3 feet tall, sometimes a little bit taller. Knockouts can get to be like 5 feet tall. But these are the hard-working roses. There are knockout roses that they have planted down the median of Bangor Highway. Easy Elegance roses were tested in Reno and Las Vegas. They put those roses in the parking lots of casinos to see how well they would do. So they're tough. Okay. Then there are English roses. I put the cabbage in there as tongue-in-cheek because now you're getting into the really super complicated flowers. And that's actually not a new thing. It's actually a return to older forms of flowers. So there he is. That's David Austin himself. And he's now gone, but his son runs the company, David Austin Jr. And this was a new variety of rose, which became its own class of rose. It began in the 1970s. And the reason why is that David Austin was sick of all of the, I think probably very American kind of roses that were being generated. And so he wanted to get back to the old style roses. Roses that were popular prior to the middle 1860s. And if you go to Europe and you go to you go to museums and you see lots of those, Vienna, Amsterdam, you see that, you'll see lots of oil paintings of still lifes. And those still lifes will have crazy looking tulips, but they'll also have these great big cabbage-like roses. And that's because that was kind of the dominant form of rose prior to the introduction of those Chinese roses that changed everything, right? So English rose, if you see a reference in a catalog to English rose, it guaranteed will be a David Austin rose. How come? Because he patented the idea. So if you go into other rose catalogs or rose collections, because all kinds of growers now are trying to crack a piece of this off for them, but they can't call them English roses. So they're going to call them something else. But you will find that the influence of David Austin roses is starting to spread throughout all the different classes of roses. And why is that? Because David Austin roses are so difficult to find. And you know why? That's on purpose. Because David Austin wants to make sure David Austin roses are the buzziest thing out there. Okay? And so you'll find that these roses are floribunda sized roses generally. They tend to behave like floribunda roses. They give you the multiple blooms per stem. There are climbing and rambling varieties available, but they are trying to normalize David Austin roses into the rest of the rose world, so they tend to have the same size of floribundas. They're very distinctive because they've got all those petals. And when you smash all those petals into a flower, they have all different kinds of shapes. But the available inventories can be challenging because at least David Austin roses, things that come in this can, only come from David Austin, which means it's very difficult to find that particular plant if you're collecting. So, however, like I said, growers understand this, and so now lots of growers are growing their own kind of old style roses, and they look a lot like David Austin's. And if you give them a fancy name, nobody will know the difference, right? So, for instance, this is a QR code, and this QR code just goes to our website, and this will give you an idea of of just other David Austin alternatives out there, because there are plenty, right? But still, it is now kind of bragging rights to actually own a David Austin rose. Okay. All right, did it work?
Yeah.
Good. Here we go. Finishing up real quick here, miniature rose classifications. Miniature, or what are now called patio roses, right? Miniature roses, actually people give them away as gifts. You'll see these, sold at Trader Joe's. You can plant those roses in the garden. Chances are they've been grown in a greenhouse, so they may need to be hardened off. But if you buy one in the middle of summertime, put it in the garden. It'll be perfectly fine, right? They are smaller flowers, but that doesn't mean that miniature roses have miniature shrubs. They tend to be smaller, about the same size as a smaller floribunda, but they can still be decent sized roses. Lots of people are disappointed that a miniature rose doesn't stay like 6 inches by 6 inches. No, but it's the flowers that make them distinctive. They are smaller. They come in those sprays as well, right? Finally, species roses, or wild roses, wildish roses, right? So there are still roses out there growing wildly. You go up into the mountains and you'll see our wild roses growing. Many of these roses are now commercially available because there's a demand for them, okay? The difference, however, is that these roses are like old roses, which means they only bloom one time a year, like all plants typically do. It's us that have worked on these roses for so long that we've tricked them into adding, this is it. When you trim a rose, you're inspiring new growth. And if it's an ever-blooming rose, every time it adds new growth, what's on the end of that? A flower, exactly. No other plant is like that. If you deadhead, you kind of hope that maybe it will get, the mood to bloom again. But with roses, if they are actively growing, then they are actively blooming. So if they take a break, it's not only that they take a break from blooming, they take a break from putting any new growth on too. Okay? So these are some of the varieties you still see available in the marketplace that act more like native roses. So rugosa roses are old Japanese roses. And you can still find Austrian copper and Persian yellow roses. Go out into what, at least it's not common anymore, but farmland. That's what you used to plant way out there on the perimeter to make sure the cows didn't get in your neighbor's field. Woods rose, that's the one that we have in our mountains. So do we have also the Nootka rose, but woods rose tends to be more common. You can find woods rose for sale here at Glover at some point in time. They're not as easily found, but they are still available. Rosa glauca, the red leaf, not as common. If you go down to St. George right now, you will see Banks rose blooming, and those are kind of a viney thing, and highly fragrant. So those are the major food groups for roses. Roses are also classified in terms of their bloom shape. That's my Ingrid Bergman. Everybody's got to get an Ingrid Bergman. Okay. So, bloom shapes. Bloom shapes are flat. They are high-centered. They can be cupped. When you get into the world of David Austin roses, you get cupped roses. You get globular roses or globular roses. Globular roses tend to not have the petals on the edge, but they're still very similar. You then get quartered roses, where you look very carefully and you see that all those petals are sort of organized in quadrants. You get rosette roses, where those quadrants can start to spiral. What you also find is a lot of, you get urn kind of roses, which tend to be very tight, and then you get pom-poms as well. However, the different kind of rose flower is often where the stage of blooming that flower is in. So David Austin roses tend to come in as pom-poms, cupped or globular. Let's call it globular. But as it opens up, those things will turn into a quartered, or will turn into a rosette, right? And urns, those are boutonnieres, right? That's what you wear to a wedding. But if you let that flower stay on the bush, then that urn will turn typically into a high center. Then, thanks to these guys here, petal count has become something that people are interested in when they shop for roses, right? And there's also kinds of bragging rights in terms of, well, how many petals does your rose have? Mine's got 120 petals. There are 120 petal roses out there. They weigh like 2 pounds. They always kind of sag down because that's a lot of weight. So you go from the ridiculous to the sublime, or maybe the sublime to the ridiculous, because you have single leaf roses that have got 4 to 8 petals. Those are typically the ones that are more close to the species rose, right? Then you add another layer of petals on top of that. So now you have 9 to 15 petals. We call that a semi-double. You add another layer of petals on top of that. So now you've got anywhere from 16 to 25 petals. Now that's a double flower. You keep adding petals and you get full flowers. Lots of your floribundas will be that way. Many of your hybrid teas will be that way. You add even more petals and you start to get what's called very full. And very full is anything more than 40 petals. And that can be 40 petals, 60 petals, 90 petals, 120 petals. And that is the world of David Austin, right? So if you're into petal count, Dave's got what you want. Okay. Then people talk about fragrance. And this is one it's difficult to talk about because you're talking about what you smell. And there are over 300 different things that go into creating rose fragrance. Rose fragrance can be affected by all kinds of things. By the time of day you're going out there sniffing them. Usually, when do they smell best? Morning or in the evening. Cool parts of the time, which means temperature is something to do with that. And that could be then a function of light exposure, right? Could be time of year. Could be where the flower is in its stage of development. They're not going to be as fragrant when they're in bud form, nor when they're about to blow. You got to find it just right, okay? But here's the heartbreak. Only 25% of modern roses are highly fragrant. So when you come in here and you ask for roses, don't assume that the roses I'm going to suggest to you are going to be fragrant. But there are lots of fragrant roses out there. However, we won't get really into the weeds on this one, but thanks to David Austin, the idea of fragrance has become not just, does that smell nice? And now all different kinds of smells. There is an old rose smell. There is a tea smell. There is a myrrh smell. There is a fruit, as in fruit blossom smell. All of those have something to do with the petals. Then you can add a musky component to that, because that stuff comes off of the stamens, which are the reproductive things in the middle of the flower. So now you've got all different permutations of fragrance that you can find. However, will that actually read that way to you? Who knows? Because not everybody's noses are created equal. So some people just want to have a pretty smell. Okay, we can take care of you that way. And this is one reason or this is one way you can look. And we'll make this list available on our website. But this is an example of some fragrant roses. And these, to a degree, most roses actually have some kind of a fragrance. But when people want a fragrant rose, they want to be able to walk into the garden here, and the rose is over there, and they can smell it. Those are the highly fragrant roses. If you're shopping for Weeks roses, for example, they put their roses on a 10-point scale. All of these guys that are Weeks roses are 10 out of 10 fragrance. So these are the ones that really smell. And then the list that'll be on our website, I think it already is on our website, there's 90 roses that I've given you, including these guys here. But there's 90 roses we don't carry all of them, right? But the bulk of all of these roses we do carry, actually. So if you want fragrant roses, we can get them for you. But not every flower, every rose that you buy will be fragrant, or equally so. Finally, it's color. People want red roses, they want yellow roses, they want pink roses. And yes, we can do that. Because no other shrub gives you this many colors and this many color combinations. They come in the standard kind of natural rose colors. They come in red, white, and pink, which is kind of what they were for a long, long time. And even that red wasn't a true red until the Chinese stud roses showed up. Okay? There's purple, there's yellow, there's coral, right? Which is kind of is that pink? Is that orange? Cream can be a white and yellow, that can be a white and pink. There's magenta. Magenta, is that pink or is that red? There's lavender. Lavender is a shade of purple. With yellow, you can get gold, right? There's orange as well. And there's even green roses. Green roses are not really green roses, they're a shade of yellow, right? The only rose colors that you can't find are blue, and trust me, everybody's been looking for one, and true black. You can get incredibly dark red roses that are considered black roses. Ink spots is one of them, and black baccara is another one, but they're not really black roses. So there's no such thing as a true black rose. Then you can take those color combinations, or you can take those colors and you can combine them. You can combine them into stripes, into blushes, where you've got a color change as you go from the base of the flower up into the edges of the petals. There's a splash. Splash is different than stripe. And there's bicolors, where the top of the petal is one distinct color, turn it around, totally different color. There's ketchup and mustard, and that's right. The top of it is kind of an orangey red. The bottom is as gold as it comes, right? There's fringes, which mean that you take a flower and you just kind of kiss the edges of it with something else. Moonstone's one of those. Okay, so we've talked about why roses are important, because elementally they're just part of our genes, right? And we've talked about the different ways that we in the industry have organized roses. And you want to know that because if you're shopping for roses, now you're more informed about how we organize stuff, right? Now, here's where the rubber hits the road, because we're talking about rose care. How do I maximize the roses? So, you've fallen in love with roses. You've found the right rose you want. Now your journey truly begins, right? And that comes with rose care. Number one, know your roots, because roses, well, you need to be aware of the kind of rooting that roses have. Number one, roses can come as own root roses, and they will actually say that on their labels. Or, and more commonly, they are grafted roses. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then there is bare root roses you can buy, which you can do right now. And there are containerized roses, which means you can buy them usually any time of year, and they're just in the shrub section. We have our own rose section, but the rose section is in the shrub section with the rest of the containerized plants that we sell. We don't sell bare root roses. We'll talk about reasons why that is. And then we talk about how to maximize your blooms. And to do that, you need to understand the soil and the light that you're giving them, the watering, the fertilizing, the pruning, the winterizing, and then the protection from pests and disease. We'll get into all this stuff in a second. We'll put this online too. Probably have to put it online after the home show though, so that what I'm saying is new and exciting for the home show. This is where you can buy roses. You can buy roses here at Glover Nursery. However, you can also buy roses online. And online rose sales is a big business. Used to be catalog roses. Remember that? Now all those catalogs are gone. But the exact same thing is now available on people's websites, right? So the roses that we will sell will be weeks roses. There's that can right there. And then there's star roses. Star roses come to us bare root, and we need to can those up, right? It's very uncommon for growers to sell to me a containered rose, right? So that's why weeks roses is so important. These are the roses that we get in fresh, probably in the next 6 weeks, right? And it's the only really huge amount of containerized roses that we get in. Star roses are always the second part of the show, because our star roses are now at a grower up in Layton, and they are growing the roses on for us. But they won't become available until middle summer, because it'll take time for those roses to grow into the container. So you pull it out, you don't get a bare root rose. It takes time to do that, right? So what's nice is that the weeks roses and some of the early roses that we have, that inventory starts to wane, and then it gets right back up again with a whole new bunch of roses from another grower. So that's kind of fun. You can just see the inventory keep changing. J&P is still around. There was some problems with J&P going bankrupt and this and that, whatever, but they are still around. And Jackson Perkins has been a source of roses for a long, long time. Proven winners, like I said, we'll carry Proven Winners roses. They're kind of a huge source of all different kinds of plants. There's David Austin. We'll have David Austin this year as well. These are some other sources of roses that you can find online. In the past, you would only get bare root roses online, or you would get what are called rose pots, which are little tiny sleeves full of with roses. They're getting a lot better at sending roses to you in the mail. And you can now get, like High Country Gardens, all they sell you is a 1 gallon rose. So it's a, you know, it's a good idea. So own root versus grafted roses. Own root roses are exactly what it means. The whole plant is that plant. So the top of the plant matches the bottom of the plant, right? And people say, well, isn't that the case with everything? No, because most roses out there are grafted roses, which means the root mass is different than the rose that you think you're buying. And that matters. So with own root roses, they're grown from rooted cuttings, okay? With grafted roses, Dr. Frankenstein gets out there and basically glues 2 kinds of roses together through bud grafting. Own root roses mean the same variety of rose is underground as above ground. With grafted roses, the rose below ground is different. So you want that rose to stay there. Okay, I'll tell you why. Technically, own root roses are more cold hardy, because if you get a lot of winter kill that inspires a lot of suckering, all those suckers will be the same rose you bought. The problem with suckering off of grafted roses is that that root mass is a different rose, and you don't want that, right? So sometimes winter damage can inspire too much sprouting from the root mass in grafted roses, so you got to take care differently. That's what they look like. I mean, there's a rooted cutting, and look, there's little roots sticking out of it. They've tricked it into doing it. That's cloning, obviously, right? And this is bud grafted. So there is the rose you're buying. This is the rootstock. That's that rose. Okay? And here's the reason why. And you're going to see him in May. This is Dr. Huey. And Dr. Huey is well, there are a lot of different rose or root stock that grafted roses are built with. But Dr. Huey proved to be the best rootstock to meet everybody's soil needs throughout the country. And so usually any of the grafted roses, and even to today, any of the roses that you buy as a bud grafted form have Dr. Huey as the rootstock. And in May, you will see ghosts out there. Ghosts of roses that used to be there. This is a ghost right here.
I think I have.
You sure do, yeah. And that's because this rose used to have another rose there. This was the rootstock. It's a gorgeous rose. Of course, it's only a single bloom, and it's a climber, okay? So with this particular rose, there was the rose that somebody planted long ago, and for whatever reason, the the stuff above ground died off. But Dr. Huey, we use Dr. Huey for a reason because it adds vigor to roses. Well, there's the vigor right there. And it kicks in. But again, you'll only see this in May because they only bloom that first time. Go into old parts of town where there are legacy roses, or there were legacy roses, and you will see Dr. Huey. He's the zombie, right? You might have your own as well. So,
A question?
yes.
What do you do when you're getting both?
You trim out Dr. Huey.
Okay.
And it'll be very obvious because he'll be coming out of the ground.
So you used to trim it all the way back
All the
down
way to the
base.
ground. Yep. Yep. Okay, know your roots. Also, bare root versus container. This is kind of topical for this time of year. There are bare root roses and there are container roses. And bare root roses come just like that. They're usually packed in sawdust and wrapped in plastic, but there you go. You take the plastic off, sawdust falls apart, and there it is. Better get that thing in the ground, right? Because you can only plant bare root roses when they're dormant. It's just like waking up for surgery. Don't want that to happen. So get those roots in the ground. Otherwise, they're container roses. Container roses are like any other container you buy here at the nursery, which means that you can do a lot more with those for a longer period of time during the year. So bare root roses, you gotta plant in the dormant season, right now. And in fact, this early springtime, it's starting to get almost too late. So you definitely, if you're thinking of bare root, do it right away, okay? With containerized, you can plant whatever you like because its little world is the container for now. You will then add it to your world later. But you can do it when it's dormant, you can do it when it's actively growing, whatever you like. You can get a lot of different varieties of bare root roses online that you might not get in containers, right? The problem with buying things online, though, is that you don't get to kick the can, is what we call it. You kick the tires. You don't get to see the stuff that you're buying. Sometimes, especially when it comes to roses, you've done all this work to figure out, I want a floribunda rose that has this kind of color and this kind of flower shape. And hopefully you can go to the nursery and see it right there. That only way you can do that is via containerized rose. Right? If you plant them in the dormant period, I have heard from people that you get the roses to establish more quickly into your landscape because obviously there's no other ground, no other soil that root mass has gotten used to. It's Utah right there. I have found, however, with my collection, my bare root roses take a lot longer to kick in. Instead, rooted or containerized roses, they might take a little bit more time because our heavy clay soils tend to be something that they have to kind of bang into before they can get in there. But that's why we encourage you to dig a hole twice as wide and such. And I myself have had tremendous luck with containerized roses. I've got a source I can buy them from. And so I've gotten some of my containerized roses from planting them in the ground. I've got them up to basically looking like they have been in my collection in a single season. So they can really hit it. Okay, so when you're planting bare root roses, you're digging the hole twice as wide as the root ball. You're planting just as deep as the roots. With bare root, you're going to build a mound that goes in the middle of the bottom of the hole for that root mass to kind of sit on top of, and then you backfill in as usual. You pack it in better because you don't want to have any air pockets. And you also want to soak those roots for at least 2 hours prior to this, because again, they've been kind of just sitting there without any water. With containerized roses, like any kind of containerized plant, you're looking for circling roots, you're removing those. Otherwise, you're planting roses like you would anything else, right? Pretty straightforward. So maximizing your blooms, understanding your rose bloom cycles. This is where you understand the calendar, and if you do that, then you can understand when to act. Okay. So number one, most roses are considered ever blooming. That is not true. They don't bloom all the time. Instead, really, that should be called repeat blooming, okay? Which is still radically different than most of the blooming things you have out there. In temperate climates like ours, roses will bloom for 6 to 8 week cycles. And in Utah, those cycles tend to be when? Spring, more like spring, early summer, so May, June. And then again, in September and October. If we have a warm fall, you will definitely have roses on holiday. Okay? So, there they are, May, June. That is, do you call that late spring? Do you call it early summer? Depends upon how hot it is outside, right? I'm thinking this year, May, June is going to be considered early summer, not late spring. We've had some late springs. There's September and October. That's the next big bloom cycle you get to look forward to. And you prepare for that as well, right? And roses will then typically take a break during the heat of the summer because nobody wants to work that hard, including a rose. However, with the kind of pruning you should do and some feeding you should do as well, you can get roses to sporadically bloom throughout the summertime as well. But not as dense as they did in May, June, and not as dense as they will in September and October again. Some roses, like Neil Diamond for me, he shuts off completely. He doesn't do anything during that hot part of the summertime. He will then wake up in the fall again. Okay. Other roses I have, Easy Spirit. Man, is that a hard-working rose. And that will pump it out even in the heat. So all seasonal care needs to be understood in relation to those two bloom cycles. So your first bloom cycle is in May, June. Your second bloom cycle is in September and October. That means then that they're dormant in January and February. And you're pruning them for this first bloom cycle this time of year. Okay? And then you're dealing with the summer heat, where you're not going to expect as many flowers. But there's some work you can do on them to prepare for September and October. After that, you then need to prepare the roses for the wintertime. Okay? And these match a lot of the rhythms that you have with other things in your landscape. But with roses, oftentimes, in order to get the world's most popular flower in your yard, you need to pay a lot of attention to how the calendar works. Okay? Soil and light conditions, that's my Chicago piece. That is the sidewalk in front of my house. Conditions. Roses are tolerant of and will adapt to many different kinds of conditions. Ideally, however, you want to give roses well-draining soil. You want to give roses soil that's high in organic content, because organic content is spare parts. Spare parts go into building flowers, right? And then you would like to have, like most things, would like to have a slightly neutral or neutral to slightly acidic soil. If you add organic matter, that happens. But does anybody know what the average pH level of the soils in the Salt Lake Valley are? 8 to 8.4. Okay? So you think, well, can I grow a rose? Absolutely you can. Roses can be tolerant of that kind of pH. They can handle salts, especially the unfortunately notoriously salty world that is the southwest part of the valley and the northwest part of Utah Valley. And that's the world where people are obliged to use Utah lake water as secondary water. And Utah lake water as secondary water is tough. There is lots of stuff that you can take for granted in Utah landscapes that you can't grow out there. But there's something you can, and that's a rose. Okay? So, light requirements. Like I said, roses are, they're technically a full sun plant, right? But Utah gives you too much sun. So full sun really only means 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. By, 4 o'clock on July 20th, it's tough out there. If there's any way that you can give your roses a break from the afternoon sun, do it. They'll pay you back. Because again, they overheat otherwise, right? The bulk of all my rose garden, I face east. And so I get to take advantage of at least some break from the afternoon sunlight. And that's a really good idea. Dappled sunlight also works, which means you could technically get down to only 2 to 4 hours of, meaningful sun maybe. But if it's dappled, the roses won't overheat as much. You might then see a lot more blooms during the hot part of the summertime. If you can moderate the temperature, they'll want to bloom, right? So, watering needs. Everybody is now really attuned to how much water you're using. Unfortunately, roses are not xeric plants, right? Roses need what's called ample water, and people say, well, what does that mean? They need enough water. And however that works, you're going to kind of understand what your rose needs depending upon the microclimate in your backyard or front yard. You'll then understand what it means to give them enough water. Okay? Roses are not, they can be water-wise, but they're not xeric plants. And water-wise plants are now really becoming just plants that are properly watered. The idea of drought tolerance is becoming a term that's as hard to define as the term organic. Because who knows what that really means? What it really does mean is that how are you delivering water to your plants, including your roses? And just understand that if it's hot, roses are going to require more water, like your entire landscape, right? However, that means then, don't use overhead spray on your roses for a lot of reasons. Number one, throwing water at things is not a good way to water anything other than your lawn. But in the past, when nobody had irrigation systems, then that's how things got watered. Well, now we have different ways to do it. We have drip irrigation, and that is the best way to hydrate your rose, to kind of guarantee that indeed water is getting to the root mass, and to also control for evapotranspiration, because now the water is being delivered right at soil line, as opposed to throwing it in the air. When you go out there and you see roses and you see the rainbow, the reason why you're seeing a rainbow is that's all the water you're not getting. It's going somewhere else, right? So, fertilizing. Roses will require some fertilizer because they have to work really hard giving you what you want. So, here's just a quick primer on fertilizer. This is called the analysis, right? Any of the fertilizers you see, here's one. There are always 3 numbers. And those 3 numbers are always in the same order. The first one is nitrogen. That gives you green growth. Right? The second one is always phosphorus. And that gives you good roots and it gives you blooms. The third one is always potassium. And that gives you just plant vigor, which means they can kind of recover from stress. Okay? Micronutrients are also important. What micronutrient is really important here in Utah?
Iron.
Iron. What happens with our high pH is a lot of times that means that iron that's already in our soils is unavailable for the plant. And we are then adding additional iron to the soils. The chelated ions, exactly. That is a problem that we have because of our heavy climate.
So how do you know if your plant needs iron?
I'll take you along to the show, and you can be my plant. Here we go. But sir, tell me more. Really? So here's something. We are the one reason why we have such heavy clay soil is because we are the bottom of what used to be an inland sea. The rest of the last bit of it is the Great Salt Lake, right? Also, what else is in our soils? Bones. Millions of years of fish bones. And that is a surprisingly good source of native phosphorus. So we don't necessarily need a lot of these blooming and rooting formulas because we have a lot of phosphorus in our soils right now. But with roses, the cool part about it is that every time they add new growth, you get a flower on the end. So all you got to do is goose these things to give you new growth, which means really all you need is a lot of nitrogen, right? And then you will need a good, potassium is a nice thing because roses are getting pruned down so much, there's just a lot more damage happening to these plants that they can handle, but a lot more damage than most of all of your garden, right? Yeah.
So I live up at about 20th East in 98, and my soil is sand.
Sure, sure.
So is it?
You are lucky. Sandy soils tend to be less alkaline because the salts have been able to leach out of the soil. That might mean that you need to worry a little bit more about water. Down here in the lower elevations, we have to worry about sometimes standing water because the clay doesn't drain very well. So you might have to be doing like more feeding and such because things are actually moving out of your soil more regularly than other
because
things.
we'll even get sand that bubbles up.
Sure.
You know, from
Well, I mean, sandy is called sandy for a reason, right? I mean, because they were trying to figure out in terms of farming what would be best, and there was this area way down here that had a lot of sandy soil. What should we call it? Should we call it sandy? Okay, that's where it came from, right? So what I've found is that fertilizers can be kind of confusing. Number one, a lot of fertilizers come with a lot of big numbers. Big numbers would be double-digit numbers, right? Then there are fertilizers that have single digits. And that means that this number with a big number is called a high analysis fertilizer. High just means bigger number, analysis means the stuff inside. Low analysis fertilizer, same stuff, less concentration. Which means more bang for your buck, but also this could be hot. You could burn things with this. Low analysis fertilizer is safe to put on whenever you feel like.
So would that be rose tone?
That would be rose tone.
Okay.
So here are, in fact, here is this right here. High analysis fertilizer. You can still use those, but you only can use them during the cool times of the year. Right now is a good time to do it. When you winterize at the end of the season, you can do it now, but you're not going to be putting this stuff on in the middle of July. Okay? Now, I've got 102 roses at home. I don't have enough room in my garage for all different kinds of fertilizers. So instead, I've found that there's one fertilizer that I can use on everything. And it comes in gigantic bags. Milorganite. This is the stuff that you could get a couple bags of Milorganite and you wouldn't need any other fertilizer for anything else in your garden, let alone your roses, right? And I go through two bags of that every year.
What's it called?
Milorganite. Milwaukee Organic Nitrogen. Milorganite. And what Milorganite is it is an excellent source of nitrogen. And that's what roses need. It's also an excellent source of iron, which is what a lot of times our roses need because of where we live.
So it's okay on everything?
Everything. You'll see it marketed as a turf fertilizer, but it can be used on everything. Okay?
And when is the best time to? Anytime?
Really? Let's talk about that, shall
Okay,
we?
sorry.
When to fertilize,
Sorry.
right? When to fertilize. So, right now is when you want to think about fertilizing. So we've also kind of put holiday orientations. So look, it's around Easter time. I guess we could have put a shamrock there too, maybe. But now is a good time to feed your roses. If you're feeding with just Milorganite, then go crazy. If you're feeding with this, at least this time of year, go crazy, right? This, you are gonna have to be very, make sure you follow the directions. But with Milorganite, when I'm out there feeding, I am just scooping and throwing. Because you don't have to be as exact. Milorganite's very forgiving that way, okay? And then, when else do you fertilize? You fertilize in July. Because the roses have now used so much to give you all those blooms in May and June. And so you need to give them something that they can probably not use as much during the heat of the season, but it'll bank in the roots so that you will be ready for September and October. And then, if you want to, it isn't mandatory, you can put a winter fertilizer on as well, so that the plants have something to eat prior to you feeding in the springtime. You're stocking the fridge. You can sleep in, because your roses are gonna wake up and they're gonna be hungry. Roses are awake right now. Roses have been awake for a month. They've had buds swell, not much, they've been a month. Right? I've got open flowers on mine, or maybe open leaves is already. So, now you gotta think about pruning. And now you gotta think about pruning, yes?
I asked a question, do you think fertilizer, if you kept it too long, loses its potency?
Not necessarily, but I wouldn't recommend you keep high analysis fertilizer sitting in a garage, because that, you can't buy like really high analysis, but it can still be a fire risk. So I would use it or lose it, right?
I mean, you have 100 roses, so you're gonna go through it, but
Sure.
I only have 9 rose bushes, so I'm not going to.
We'll talk. We'll talk. Because you're about to get more roses. No. Yeah, I mean, there are other ways that you can. There are other sources of low analysis fertilizer that come in smaller bags.
Sure. I was just wondering.
What's nice though is that Milorganite does come in these big bags, and if you need it, it's all there. Yes.
And I had mine in the garage over the winter, and my house didn't explode.
Sure.
So it's okay.
No, but in
I
terms
just
of
mean so
Yeah.
people know that it's not
Right.
going to explode.
you don't want to keep kind of piling up fertilizer in your garage for the next 10 years, right? Basically, kind of use it within a season.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Would you request, or like, would you suggest doing a soil test before you start fertilizing?
I mean, soil tests are nice. I think you can kind of assume, however,
Okay.
that you've got heavy clay soil and high alkaline soils.
Okay.
However, we have soil testing kits here you can buy that give you kind of a basic narrative.
Okay.
If you really want to get all the nitty-gritty stuff, then just send it into USU Extension. They do that all the time.
Would
In
you
fact,
pick different parts of your yard or just one part?
you might want to. I mean, it's up to you.
Okay.
But if you live there and you sort of are curious about the different microclimates you might have, it's a good idea to get to know your yard. Right?
Depends on how big it is.
Okay.
Sorry, one more.
Yes.
And this, everyone probably knows this, but you thought, if you fertilize in like November, you don't need to fertilize December, right? You just
Nope.
fertilize in one of those months.
Exactly. Okay, so pruning. Roses are going to require some pruning this springtime. The reasons why you prune, because they have thorns. Did you hear about that? Roses have thorns? So that means that oftentimes people need to keep them within a manageable size. And to do that, you prune. You stimulate new growth. You introduce stress into the plant, and the plant will then have a stress response, which is a flower. At the end of that flower is a fruit. Okay? And then you're also preparing the roses for the upcoming season. Okay? And you ought to be thinking about taking roses indoors. If you have a rose garden, we are civilized people, which means cut roses and put them in the yard, in the kitchen. There's nothing more wonderful. Right?
It's a cutting garden.
Huh?
It's a cutting
It
garden.
is a cutting garden, really, it is. It is. So, types of pruning. There's renewal pruning. That typically happens this time of year, where you're chopping things back. Doesn't have to happen that way, but if people have roses that have gotten too large, then now is the time to take them back to a considerably smaller size. You'd be surprised at how easily they'll just bounce right back. There's thinning out, which is usually what people do when they're pruning roses. And so that typically is the spring routine. You've got roses at a certain size, and now you're just cleaning them out, okay? Then there's deadheading. That's that light pruning that you're kind of doing all the time in order to maximize the amount of flowers that you get, okay? So, when do I prune? Someone asked. You prune right now. And that is the renewal or the thinning pruning that one does. Okay? The second time you prune is going to be in July. And we might just amend this to deadheading or thinning pruning. Because you are taking off a lot of that new growth that came to you in May, June. You want to kind of chop it back and then allow the plant to flush from that in order to give you all those flowers with also kind of a roughly the same size plant. Because otherwise roses are going to just add on to what you leave with new growth. That's how they get to be so huge, right? And then you will do some winter cleanup. Not much, but you will do some pruning as you're shutting the yard down for the winter time. If only to make sure things don't just break. So, people say, okay, Paul, give me a calendar. I got my phone out right now. Tell me when it is. There is no good calendar date because Utah does what it does in the springtime. But Utah does give you a nice deadline. That is the forsythia. So when you see forsythias in the landscape, you better make a plan to get out there and take care of your roses. Roses will also kind of tell you if you go out there and you'll see that there's all kinds of bud swell and such. And if there are roses or leaves that are actually starting to poke out, that may be the sign of an early spring like we have now. But the forsythias will tell you that in general, the environment outside is ready to wake up or has already done so. And you better now jump on board. Okay?
You should start putting the fertilizer around, like olive granules.
Yes, you can fertilize into April as well. Fertilizing is not usually, it's a little bit wider window for fertilizing. Pruning, you do want to kind of get that done because that is the starting point for what you're going to then get later. Yes?
I have several roses that have their foliage on them still.
Yeah.
Some are kind of greenish still.
Mm-hmm. Called marquescence.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do I trim all of those off when I get rid of all of the foliage?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you do that. There are roses in warmer climates like California and Texas. Roses are evergreen plants.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you going to cover, the problem I have is I have a rose that was this big, and now I have like 4 roses all around it, and the center's dead. I want to dig them up and separate them and move them again. Is that, no?
We might talk about that after class.
Okay.
See me after class.
You're in trouble.
Just because that is more of a transplanting
That's what I
situation
wanna do.
that is not unique to roses, but kind of unique to shrubs in general, right? Oh, sorry, we added this slide. So if you're getting ready for pruning, then these are the tools you need to get ready for pruning. So you better get a good pair of gloves because roses have thorns. And roses are rose outfitters, I suppose, like us, will sell you gauntlets because this is not going to be enough because they'll tear you up here. So you wear gauntlets that will cover the entire forearm, right? Get a good pair of pruners. Get a good pair of loppers. Life is too short for cheap pruners. And make sure those pruners and loppers are sharp. If you saw it last fall, we had Blade Butler here, and they'll be back for springtime, and that is a wonderful way for you to get your pruners prepared for the season. Because a lot of work means also that pruners just get dull pretty easily. Kitchen knives do the same thing, right? Disinfectant, you do want to at least have some isopropyl alcohol that will just disinfect your pruners. And then other kinds of things to make it comfortable, whether it's a kneeling mat. These kneeling things here double as a seat, but then they're also a kneeling mat that at least has some way for you to leverage yourself up. They're wonderful. Yeah, and then maybe knee pads too. Okay.
What's the sealer?
Oh, that's Elmer's glue. We'll talk about sealing your canes, but if you're going to seal your canes, then that means that you need to have something to do with them. And Elmer's glue turns out to be a very good kind of organic seal. However, it dries clear. But now you can get Elmer's glue that has glitter in it and use it, because you will then know where you've been. Right?
But why do you seal it?
Here we go. So number one with pruning, we can talk a bit more detail about all the different ins and outs of pruning, but generally you're just looking for old damaged canes first. Canes that aren't working anymore need to be taken out. Okay? Young healthy canes tend to look different. They look a little bit greener, but not as thick. Okay. Older canes, if it does have a decent amount of new growth on it, then keep it. But you'll begin to understand what is a truly old, unproductive cane and what is just an established cane. And then the big thing is you're encouraging, or you're not encouraging, any kind of growth that goes inside the plant. Can you see that one there? That cane's coming out. It's a nice green cane. Why wouldn't I want to keep that? Because it's in the inside of the bush. What you're going to do is treat rose bushes like fruit trees. And you're going to clean out the middle. Because the middle, if it's clean, then you've got lots of good air circulation, which means you can resolve your problems with powdery mildew. And you get a lot of nice light penetration, which warms the plant up in the springtime, and it also will enable the plant to get as much sun energy as it can, because that's essentially how they make their food. Yes?
Question is, what about like the landscape?
Here we go. So, you always start with sharpened and disinfected pruners. And your cuts ought to be 45 degrees away from an outward facing bud. Does everybody figure that out? Outward facing bud. So I can look right now and I can see a bud that's facing me. Do I want to use that bud? How come? It's growing on the inside. Look, this one's growing on the inside, just like that. There's an outward facing bud. You're going to build your roses from the outside, going like this. Okay? So that means you're going to cut down to that bud. And when you do, then you will then force growth to come out from the bud will be there. Another bit of that branch will come out from behind that bud. The secondary bud will actually kick in. That'll become a branch. And what's on the edge of that all the time? Flowers. Right? Okay. And it's 45 degrees. Because that is a good way to make sure that you don't have water that collects around that wound. And you want to have that 45 degrees going away from the bud, not towards the bud. Okay? I'll have we'll see it here. It tends to be, yes?
Are we supposed to disinfect in between every bush?
Who's got that kind of time? However, if you've got a rose that you know has had some powdery mildew issues, for me it's Tropicana. I know that if I'm around Tropicana and I'm pruning, I better disinfect after I deal with her. Then I can be fine elsewhere. But if you know there's some vectors for particularly fungal issues, then work disinfecting into that, right? I guess if you really wanted to be completely safe and surgical about it, yeah, every single time, but woof. Yes?
So I just put the isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle and
Perfect.
just keep it in my,
Perfect.
and just, so it makes it quicker.
Makes it quicker, yeah, right? Make sure these cuts are clean. Don't make them jagged. It's kind of tough to see because on Saturday it'll be a giant screen, but this gives you an idea of what that cut ought to look like.
I'll pop
yes.
it in the Facebook group about this event so people can look at that later if
Okay,
they'd like
yeah.
to.
That just gives you a better idea about what at least correct pruning might look like. With hybrid tea and grandiflora roses, if you're doing renewal pruning, you can chop those down to 18 inches, even if they're this tall.
Is that best?
Depends on what you want the plant to do, right? I'm probably not going to do that with my roses. I'm going to do more thinning out, which also means then you probably take the rose down to half of the size it was last year.
What if it's a tree?
Trees, you're only going to be playing with the bush above, right? Because that is a bush that's been grafted onto a stem. That,
So then take it really small
Mhm.
and it'll grow.
exactly. Trees you tend to have to worry about because trees are usually near traffic areas, and you really want to control the shape of that, otherwise people are catching themselves. Floribunda English roses, 24, 26 inches tall if you really want to give them a good haircut. Otherwise, cut them down to half the size and thin them. Climbing roses, you're identifying those big major canes, and then you're pruning off of those major canes. You're not taking that 8-foot, 10-foot vine, or vine, I just said it, climbing rose down to 2 feet again, because you're defeating the whole idea of why you planted a climber. Roses have thorns. All right. Someone said, what about those landscape and ground cover roses? Well, the cool part about those roses is get out the head share. You can trim these like you can euonymus.
Last roses? Would that be
Absolutely.
considered?
So you don't
Yeah.
have to thin the middle, that's
Nope,
what I'm
nope, you don't have to. Yeah. So those roses, yeah, those are like boxwoods.
Yep.
Put in all kinds of shapes. Yes.
And do you remove the leaves before you prune, like the last year's leaves that
She's,
remain?
you do, you should do that, just in case there's anything left over on those leaves, right? It isn't terribly critical. A lot of times, as things are really starting to kick, the flower will finally disconnect those leaves. But if you're in there, you might as well just clean everything up, right? But the cool part about it is that roses are so forgiving. Unless you're hacking down into the ground, there's probably not lasting damage you can do to a rose. You'll always forgive it. Yes.
Sorry. This is my first time with roses, so all mine are just like this, like just still there. So
Mhm.
when I prune, like this next week or so,
Right.
I wanna cut leaves off as well.
Yep. If they have leaves on them.
They do.
Sometimes leaves,
It's
sometimes
fine.
roses. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Deadheading. Deadheading could be just going out there and trimming the dead heads off. Well, I found, I did this last year. I thought I had cracked the code. And so I just trimmed the rose hips off and nothing bloomed. I didn't introduce enough stress into my roses. So when you're deadheading, you are not just trimming off the spent flowers. You're doing the 5-leaf rule. And that means you look down on the cane, and you identify the first 5-leaf cluster. And that is usually deeper into the cane. And you do that because you're looking for a more stable part of the cane. Plus, you're also going to be introducing the stress because the rose is going to miss that new growth. So it's going to want to replace it. And when it replaces it, what do you get? Another rose. Right? Then you get more thorns. Yeah. Okay. Sealing your cane. Someone said, how come? And that's because we have cane borers. If there is something that can be truly catastrophic to a rose, it's a cane borer. Unfortunately, cane borers are the good guys. They are the larvae of things like beneficial wasps and cutter bees. Okay? So what they'll do is they will lay their eggs there. That egg will turn into a larva. The larva will go right to the pith of the cane. I've had cane borer damage that goes down 18 inches.
What does that look like?
Looks like this. Right?
So
You can see it.
what does the outside of the?
Oh, it's all shrunken. It's all, you can tell that there's something wrong, right? So what you do is you use the glitter glue, and you do that every single time you prune. What that does is it covers up the smell. And then these beneficial insects go elsewhere to do their thing. But otherwise they can do really serious damage to roses. Yes. So, winter prep, you're just basically going to be trimming back any excess growth that you got in September and October to a point where if we get some heavy snow, it doesn't break. You don't want to give your roses a spring-like bloom, well, prune in fall, because winter's going to take her share. And if you don't leave enough for her, well, she'll take everything, right? Yes.
Your bare root roses,
Yeah.
hold off on pruning that whole first year then?
No.
Or you can still go ahead and do kind of like what's listed?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're probably going to kind of ease into it, but generally, you can treat those roses like you do other roses once they get established. Okay, so rose care in the wintertime, you're now going to be using the leaf litter that you have in your garden. Why not? And putting them to bed, tucking them in with a blanket of leaves. And that goes up into the over top of the roots and the root crown of, or the crown itself of the plant. And then again, it's just, you're tucking it in. The reason why you do that is because you're getting insulation. That'll help protect against ground freezing. It'll also seal in some moisture too, right? It's important for own root roses, but it's mandatory for grafted roses, because you really want to make sure nothing happens to that part of the rose that's above ground. Okay. Compost or leaf litter is best. Just want to make sure you're not using diseased leaves. You're just kind of perpetuating a problem. Rose care. Okay, there the aphids. Now, in terms of common problems with things and roses, the pests tend to be limited to aphids, thrips, and spider mites. Okay? Aphids, frankly, are a nuisance. They will not kill your rose. Okay? People kind of they don't like insects, so you can see lots of aphids, so it bugs you, but they're not going to kill your rose. Right? They may warp some of the new growth, but they also tend to be a cool season experience. Right? Thrips can be nasty, because these guys will bore into the flower, then they will wake up, and they will chew their way out. And you will see whole chunks of the buds removed, or you will see, at least once the flower opens, you will see where it was damaged. I've gotten used to that, because roses give you so many flowers, most of them look just fine. Okay? Thrips tend to hit light colored roses. Okay? Spider mites. Spider mites are an issue that lots of plants have with our hot, dry weather. And that will manifest with the leaves looking kind of mottled and not the right color. The diseases that we tend to have. In terms of fungal issues, it's usually just powdery mildew, and it's some kind of a black spot. That's really the only two we have. Nutrient deficiency, someone asks, how do I know that? That's usually chlorosis, right? And chlorosis is an issue that many of our plants in Utah manifest, and those are yellow leaves that have very bright green veins. That's chlorosis. That's anemia. That's iron deficiency. Okay? Then you have these cane borer problems. You also will have moon-sized chunks taken out of the leaves. Those are leafcutter bees. So as long as you control the cane borer, leafcutter bees, that's basically just cosmetic damage. So it's not going to kill the plant, unless of course leafcutters defoliate plants, but usually they don't. Okay?
How about root weevils?
We don't really have a problem with that, have you?
Oh, yeah.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, that, on my hydrangeas, my peonies,
And your roses? Really? Okay.
yeah, so,
Then some kind of a root drench, but we don't usually see that problem, but I'll add that to this. So with aphids, beneficial insects. We sell ladybugs. There's all different kinds of contact sprays you can use, but really with aphids, all you will need to do is separate the aphid from the bud. Aphids are the chickens of the insect world. And once they leave, once you've either shaken them off or blown them off with high pressure water, they rarely come back. So it's kind of messy and you get kind of wet, but you're in there just blowing off these things with high pressure water, and that tends to resolve that problem. Aphids, however, come in waves, but those waves tend to get less and less as it gets hotter, and so the aphids go away.
I've gone years without aphids, and last year
Right.
we had so many.
And that's because of the wet spring we had, right? The successively wet springs we had for 3 years in a row. So thrips, there are beneficial nematodes that you can use that will track down these thrips. Otherwise, thrips are very difficult to control. What you have to do is daily inspections of your garden. Where you see any kind of thrip damage in a bud, you will then take that bud off. And you will then throw it away because there will be a thrip and eggs inside. Okay, so sometimes you have to wait for the problem to happen before you can track it down. Spider mites, there is insecticidal soap that you can use to take care of that. There is also just systemic insect stuff that you can use. That might have impact with bees, however, and bees love roses. Okay. Powdery mildew, copper fungicide. Do it right now. And you should have also done it back in November to control for that. Because you're controlling the outbreak of spores. Same thing with black spot. With this, you definitely want to get rid of the foliage as well. So if you've had problems with this, don't let those roses keep that foliage through the wintertime. Take defoliate them as they're going into winter. Nutrient deficiencies, you feed the plant. Iron is a great idea just to control that because those nutrient deficiencies tend to be an iron deficiency. Okay. Leaf cutter bees, again, you kind of just leave alone because they're the good guys. Cane borers, you are using that seal. You generally don't have to seal your first pruning because those insects are not out there yet. But it's the pruning you do in the summertime where you definitely need to seal your canes because the insects that matter are actively out there looking for rosewood. They can smell it. And so what you're doing is you're sealing off that smell. Yes?
I have a question. It's not exactly on roses, but powdery mildew, if you know like a dahlia gets it late in the season, is there something that you can do with this before it gets on there? Because it can't spray.
I mean, if your dahlias are getting powdery mildew, it's because the powdery mildew is already there.
Okay.
Right? So treating that powdery mildew issue with copper fungicide in the fall has been manageable.
Okay.
Follow it up in springtime.
Okay.
Okay? And then remove any foliage every single year because that's going to be the vector
Same
where
with,
that stuff sits.
with like a shrub, if you see that it has some powdery mildew, removing the foliage on it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a serious powdery mildew problem that it could also be cultural. You might have too much water in that area. Powdery mildew usually happens when you're over spraying things. It tends to resolve itself when you switch over to drip irrigation. And then there's a word about systemic insecticides. So, this is a very popular product. Do I have it? Well, it's over here, but it looks like this. It's in these distinctive blue bottles. Can you hand me a rose pair? Real quick here. It's over here. There it is. Oh, they moved it.
This one?
Yes. So this is the stuff that you can use. It does a great job. It's a 3-in-1. So it's got fungicide in it, it's got insecticide, it's got food. The problem is that it is a systemic product, which means it is applied to the base of the plant, it enters the plant through the root mass, and the plant then poisons itself. And if it then poisons itself, if the juices, the fluids inside the plant are toxic enough to kill an aphid, they can definitely do damage to bees, including she can't find her way home. And there's colony collapse syndrome, right? So I don't use this on my roses. And I probably, I got a little bit more work to do, but it's just, it's uncanny when you go out there and the roses, or the bees that you see, they're just beside them, right? So use it, understand what you're doing, right? I don't necessarily recommend it, but it is something that we sell. Because people sometimes don't want to work as hard as I have to sometimes to control these things. But just understand that things that you do, chemicals that you add to the garden can have other consequences, other side effects. And all of us are just scratching our heads, what is it about bees? Right? And I will be at booth 1640 at the home show, but you'll basically you'll be getting one more time, whatever you got just now. Yes?
So, on the fertilizing, that's dry fertilizer that you just throw out?
Yes.
You have to spray it down after you
Maybe just a little bit of water just to make sure that it sits down, doesn't like blow away. But otherwise, it's slow release, so you don't need, liquid fertilizer tends to be kind of like a McDonald's meal. Also, liquid fertilizer tends to move out of the soil quickly because if you're watering plants, then that liquid fertilizer leaches out of the soil with the water.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because the hose isn't hooked up yet, so
Oh, no.
I was wondering about if you have the water.
Generally, the seasonal precipitation will get it to settle.
Do you have to dig it in? You just throw it?
I guess maybe you could if you really wanted to make sure that it's going to stay where it is. But given how what I have to do for 102 roses, I'm just throwing, and it sits, and it tends to stay there. The granules are still like this big. They're not. It's not dust. Yes.
Is it possible to make a cutting from a grafted top, or will
Sure.
it not work?
Sure.
It will become the top part?
It'll become the top part. Yes.
Okay.
That's how roses. That's how all the owner roses are now. Is you take a cutting of a rose and you get it to root. That has just been something that has not been as easily done, and I assume that the science behind that has gotten better to the point that you've got a lot of sources of roses now that only give you owner roses. But the sources that I have, you still have a lot of grafted roses available. One thing about grafted roses is because they are grafted onto Dr. Huey rootstock, they're supercharged. Own root roses will only then behave as much as those roots want to. There's a reason why you put a rose onto Dr. Huey, because then it goes. You get the rose you want sooner. Yes.
Do you mind explaining the fungal spray you said to do in the spring and the fall?
Copper fungicide.
Okay.
It comes in either a liquid form or in a dust.
Okay. And just onto the canes then, because that's all we have right now.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and also after you've cleaned off it should happen generally after you've also pulled all of that dead foliage that you've or the blanket you've tucked in with. You'll pull that clear. You also tend to treat the ground as well, because what you want to do is just make sure that the spores don't wake up. Yes.
I have kind of a silly question. My yellow roses, when they bloom, they turn white. They don't stay bright yellow. I've had a lot of people tell me different reasons why that.
What have they said?
That, well, someone told me that after the bee pollinate, get in, come around it, that it fakes their color.
Well, so roses will, the flower itself will go through a stage as well. So you will see all of your flower colors fade as the rose itself, as the flower itself starts to age.
Sun bleach.
And the sun will bleach it as well. But roses, flowers don't last more than 2 days, 3 days.
They're, I've bought two different yellow. I love the yellow, but they come out the next day, they're fading.
But that's normal, because roses oftentimes only last a day. That's why you want to get out there. That's why, plan on routine walks through your rose garden. Otherwise, you'll miss things. Right?
Thank you.
Anything else? Is that it?
Thank you so much. That was awesome.